The field stank of blood and churned earth. A boy no older than 15 lay face down in the mud, his fingers still wrapped around a wooden spear. He had never held a weapon before that morning. By noon, he was dead. He was not a soldier. He was a farmer's son, and the war that killed him. He did not know why it started. He did not know the name of the Lord who commanded it. He did not even know the name of the kingdom he was supposedly defending. But he only knew that men on horses had ridden into his village 3 days earlier. They told him to march. So he marched. This was the medieval world, a world where peasants bled for quarrels they did not understand, where serfs were pulled from their fields and thrown into battles between kings they would never meet, where the poor died so the powerful could expand their maps by a few miles. They fought wars they didn't start, and no one remembers their names. The feudal system was a pyramid of obligation. At the top sat the king. Below him, the great lords. Below them, the lesser nobles and knights. And at the very bottom, crushed beneath the weight of everyone above, were the peasants. They worked the land. They paid the taxes. They gave a portion of everything they grew to their lord. In return, they received protection. But protection came with a price. When war arrived, the Lord had the right to call upon his peasants, not to ask, to demand. A serf had no choice. He could not refuse. He could not flee. His body belonged to the estate, as surely as the cattle in the fields. And so when the drums of war echoed across the valley, the poorest men in the kingdom were handed weapons they had never trained with. They were lined up in rows. They were told to hold the line. Most of them didn't survive long enough to learn how. The medieval battlefield was a nightmare of chaos. Steel clashed against steel. Horses screamed. My arrows darkened the sky like swarms of locusts, and somewhere in the middle of it all stood the peasant levy, untrained, unarmored, and utterly terrified. They carried spears because spears were cheap, sometimes just sharpened sticks. Their shields, if they had any, were thin wood that splintered on first impact. They wore no chainmail, no plate armor, only the rough wool tunics they worked the fields in. Against mounted knights in full armor, they were lambs before wolves. For the knight had trained since childhood. He had practiced with sword and lance for years. His war horse alone was worth more than a peasant's entire life earnings. When he charged, the ground shook. The peasant had nothing but fear and a prayer. Yet still he was expected to stand, to fight, to die if necessary, because his lord commanded it, because the system demanded it, because he had no other option. What were these wars even about? Land. Always land. A duke claimed a valley that another duke also claimed. A king wanted a province that belonged to a rival king. A lord felt insulted by another lord at a feast and demanded satisfaction through blood. Petty grievances, wounded pride. Greed dressed up as honor. The peasants knew none of this. They did not sit in the great halls where these decisions were made. They did not hear the negotiations that failed. They were not consulted when their lords chose violence over peace. The one morning they were planting crops. The next morning they were handed a weapon and told to kill strangers from the next valley. Strangers who were also peasants, also confused, also fighting a war they didn't start. Sometimes men who had traded together at the same market found themselves on opposite sides of a battlefield. Sometimes cousins faced cousins. Blood spilled over borders that meant nothing to those who lived on either side of them. The lords would eventually make peace. Then they would sign treaties. They would exchange prisoners and toast to new alliances. But the dead peasants would remain in the ground. Survival was rare. Glory was rarer. When a battle was won, the credit went to the knights, to the lords, to the king who commanded from the hilltop. Songs were written about their bravery. Their names were carved into history. The peasants were not mentioned. They were numbers, casualties, acceptable losses. If a peasant somehow survived, if he fought his way through the carnage and walked off that field alive, he returned home with nothing. No reward, no recognition, often no compensation for the months of labor he had lost. His crops may have rotted while he was gone. His family may have starved, and if he was wounded, if he lost a hand or an eye or a leg, he was simply discarded. There were no pensions for peasant soldiers, no care for the broken. Or he would limp back to his village and try to work the fields with whatever remained of his body. Many couldn't. Many became beggars. Many simply died. The church told them this was God's order, that the king ruled by divine right, that the lords were placed above them by heavenly design. To question the system was to question God himself. So they accepted it. Generation after generation, fathers watched their sons marched off to war. Mothers wept in doorways, one knowing they might never see their children again, and when the bodies came back, if they came back at all, the village buried them in unmarked graves and tried to carry on. There was no rebellion, not yet. The weight of tradition was too heavy, the fear of punishment too strong, the belief that this was simply how the world worked too deeply ingrained. They were born to serve, they lived to serve, and when their lords demanded it, they died to serve. The irony was bitter. The peasants vastly outnumbered the nobility. For every knight in shining armor, there were hundreds of farmers with calloused hands. If they had united, if they had refused, no army of lords could have stopped them. But they didn't know their own power. They had been taught since birth that they were lesser, that their lives were worth less, that obedience was virtue and resistance was sin. So they kept marching, kept fighting, kept dying. Wars came and went. Borders shifted. The crowns changed heads, and through it all, the peasants remained. An endless supply of expendable bodies for the ambitions of men who would never learn their names. There is a mass grave in France. Archaeologists found it centuries later, dozens of skeletons piled together. Young men, mostly. Their bones showed signs of brutal trauma. Skulls caved in, limbs hacked apart. No armor, no weapons of quality. Peasants, levied for a war between two minor lords over a strip of forest. The forest still stands. The lords are long forgotten, and beneath the earth, the bones of nameless boys remain. They fought a war they didn't start, and that war forgot them before their bodies were even cold. History remembers the kings, the conquerors, the generals who moved armies like pieces on a board. It remembers sieges and treaties and the rise and fall of dynasties. But it forgets the hands that held the spears, the feet that marched through mud, down the hearts that beat with terror in the moments before the charge. Those hearts belonged to farmers, to fathers, to sons. They did not choose violence. Violence was chosen for them. They did not seek glory. Glory was never offered to them. They only wanted to tend their fields, feed their families, and live small, quiet lives. Instead, they were given death on a field far from home, for a cause that was never theirs. The medieval world was built on their backs, and it was soaked in their blood.